The sound was small, almost polite, like the end of a sentence. That quiet click was all it took for the room to change. The steady hum of my oxygen machine stopped, and the air itself seemed to tighten around me. I didn't need to open my eyes to know what had happened. My chest sank heavy and cold, as if someone had reached inside and pressed pause on my lungs. Then I heard him, my son Daniel. His laugh was low, casual, coated in that careless tone I used to mistake for confidence. "Mum doesn't even use half of these things," he muttered. "She just lies there, wasting power." That was when I realized it. My air had been traded for his battery life. It's strange how betrayal never sounds dramatic when it happens. Sometimes it's quiet, so ordinary that you almost miss it. I heard the scrape of a phone cable across the tile, then the faint hum of electricity returning, but not to me, to his device. I wanted to speak, to tell him what he'd done, but the words stayed locked inside me, trapped somewhere between my lungs and my heart. Then the door burst open. Clara. My granddaughter ran in, her voice cracked with panic. "Dad, what did you just do?" "You unplugged Grandma's oxygen." Daniel didn't even look up. "Relax," he said. "It's just for a bit. Her levels don't drop that fast." For a second, I could hear nothing but the blood rushing in my ears. Clara's anger filled the room, that fierce, trembling kind of love that only someone still young enough to hope can carry. "She needs that oxygen to breathe," she shouted. "You could have killed her." Daniel scoffed. "You're overreacting." "If she stops?" "She stops. The insurance will cover it." The words hit harder than any slap. They stripped away every illusion I had left about who he'd become. My own son was willing to gamble my breath for convenience. As the room spun, I thought of all the nights I had stayed awake to soothe his fever. The meals I skipped so he could eat better. The birthday gifts wrapped when the bills were overdue. I used to believe motherhood meant endless forgiveness, but in that moment I learned something new. Even a mother's breath has limits. I could feel my pulse slowing. Clara's voice blurred into the distance, and somewhere in that fading space between sound and silence, I made a promise to myself. If they ever thought they could take the air from my lungs, they were wrong. I would find another way to breathe, and when I did, they would never forget it. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I lost my oxygen, but because I stopped giving them mine. For most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard, stayed fair, and loved your family, they would see it, and that would be enough. I was wrong. I spent 40 years as an accountant, balancing other people's numbers and trying to keep my own family's life steady. 3 kids, 1 sick husband, and a mortgage that always seemed to grow faster than my paycheck. I learned to stretch a dollar until it begged for mercy. I stayed up at night with homework, tax returns, and feverish foreheads. I thought that was what a good mother did. You sacrifice quietly, because love doesn't need an audience. But somewhere along the way, Daniel rewrote the story. He started telling people that I was controlling, that I micromanaged his life, that I couldn't let go. At first I laughed it off. I thought it was just his way of venting. But then neighbors started looking at me differently. A grocery clerk once said, "Your son told me you can't stand being alone. Must be tough." She smiled like she was offering sympathy. I went home that day and cried into my hands. You see, when someone wants to mistreat you, the first thing they do is convince the world and themselves that you deserve it. It's easier to neglect a cold mother than a caring one. Easier to ignore a woman labeled as bitter than one who's heartbroken. Daniel never mentioned how many times I covered his rent, or how I helped when Olivia battled postpartum depression and couldn't even hold her baby. He forgot that I sold my wedding ring to help him keep his house. To him, every sacrifice became proof of my supposed control. Every no became cruelty. Every silence became manipulation. People don't realize how powerful a lie can be when it's told by someone you love. It doesn't just stain your reputation, it rewrites your history. One day you wake up and realize you've become a stranger in your own story. At my husband's funeral, Daniel leaned over to his cousin and whispered loud enough for others to hear, "Look at her. Not a single tear. Did she even love Dad?" I heard him, but I stayed still. They all did. No one saw me cry in the shower that morning when I found George's toothbrush still wet from the last time he used it. No one saw me pause before closing his closet, my hands trembling around his jacket. Pain doesn't always perform. Sometimes it folds laundry. Sometimes it pays bills. Sometimes it just breathes quietly, trying not to drown. Daniel needed me to be the villain so he could live with what he was doing. He turned my silence into guilt, my composure into coldness. I became the mother people whispered about, the one who was too proud, too distant, too much. But here's the truth. I learned too late. People rewrite you so they can sleep at night. They paint you into the role that justifies their cruelty, because it's easier to harm someone when you've already convinced yourself they earned it. And once that happens, love doesn't fade. It gets buried under stories that never belonged to you. When I came home from the hospital, I thought recovery would mean peace. Instead, it felt like punishment wrapped in politeness. Daniel had prepared a space for me, that's how he put it. But when I saw it, I realized it wasn't a room. It was a storage closet that used to hold broken Christmas lights, an old treadmill, and boxes of things nobody cared enough to fix. There were no windows, no vent, just a single lamp with a broken switch that flickered like a weak heartbeat. He called it temporary, said it would be just until the guest room was ready. It never was. The door didn't close all the way, which meant I could hear the TV from the living room, the laughter that wasn't meant for me, and the silence that definitely was. Ryan, my teenage grandson, passed by one afternoon and smirked. "Nice pod, Grandma. Don't forget to mute your breathing. I'm in a match." He said it like a joke, but it landed like a bruise. I didn't even understand what he meant until I heard him later laughing with his friends online, calling me the breathing screensaver. It's strange how cruelty can hide inside jokes. It sounds harmless until you realize it's the language of how people learn to stop seeing you. I started eating alone. They'd leave my meal on a tray by the hallway. Cold soup, canned beans, sometimes oatmeal that had already turned dry. Once I found the expiration date scratched off with a marker. I ate it anyway. Hunger, I learned, has no pride. Olivia never said anything cruel, but her silence was a wall. Whenever I tried to speak, she'd sigh, say she was tired, or pretend she didn't hear me. The kind of tired she claimed to be wasn't from work, it was from not wanting to care. Daniel had a new obsession. Bills, numbers, efficiency. He would wave the electric statement in my doorway like a verdict. "This oxygen machine is eating $60 a month, Mum. During peak hours, that's basically theft." He said it like I was draining the house dry, just by breathing. The next week, I woke up gasping. The machine was off again. I crawled toward the cord, my hands shaking, trying to plug it back in. When I finally did, it stuttered like a dying heart before humming back to life. Daniel walked past, glancing down at me. "You could have waited until after 6. Power's cheaper then." And he just kept walking. That's when I started to understand what was happening. They weren't trying to kill me. Not outright. They just wanted me smaller, quieter, less expensive. Every missed meal, every cold night, every unplugged cord was a message: you take up too much space. And that kind of slow erasure doesn't leave bruises. It just makes you fade. So I started writing it all down. Every incident, every power cut, every ignored call for help. Not because I wanted pity, but because I needed proof. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, you'll understand. It's not the isolation that hurts the most. It's realizing that the people you love are practicing how to live without you while you're still there. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day when the air feels heavy but still. I was reaching for my blanket when the crash came sharp, sudden, final. The oxygen tank tipped over, hit the tile, and rolled toward my feet. I tried to steady it, but my hands were too slow, my body too fragile. The world tilted with me as I fell. The floor was cold, and my shoulder took the weight of the fall. The hose twisted under me, bending like a lifeline knotted too tight. I tried to pull air, but there was nothing. Just that awful pause, that silence that made me realize how close breath and death really sit next to each other. I whispered Daniel's name. No answer. I tried Ryan's, though. I could already hear the muffled sound of his video game through the wall, his laughter mixing with the fake gunfire of his match. Somewhere Olivia's sitcom laughed too, a track of joy that didn't belong in the same house as me. Time slows down when you're helpless. Every second stretches bending until it almost breaks. I thought of George, then my husband. And for a moment, I could almost see him standing in the doorway, his hand reaching out. I nearly reached back before remembering that he was gone, buried 10 years ago. By the time Clara arrived, 20 minutes had passed. She said later that she just had a feeling. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was love that still listened. She opened the door to find me on the floor, pale and shaking. I'll never forget her face, how it shifted from worry to fury in one heartbeat. Grandma. She cried, kneeling beside me, reattaching the hose with trembling hands. The air rushed back into me, loud and alive. I could finally breathe again, but she couldn't. Anger was suffocating her now. She stood, eyes blazing, and stormed down the hall. "How long has she been on the floor?" she shouted. Ryan called back, annoyed. "I don't know." I had my headset on. Olivia mumbled something from the couch. A door slammed. The laugh track on the TV filled the silence. When Clara came back, her hands were still shaking. "I'm calling the police," she said, reaching for her phone. I grabbed her wrist. My voice came out dry and cracked, but firm. "No," I said. Her eyes widened. "Grandma, they're hurting you. We have to report this." I shook my head slowly. "Not yet. We don't call. We watch. We gather. We do this right." She looked at me, confused and angry, but she saw something in my eyes that made her stop. This wasn't fear. It was focus. I had spent months being silent, enduring, hoping kindness would come back if I just waited long enough. But that fall showed me what waiting really cost. It wasn't patience anymore, it was surrender. So right there, still on the cold tile floor, I made another promise. If they were going to treat me like I didn't exist, then I would make sure my silence left a record. I wouldn't scream. I would document. Because sometimes the smartest kind of revenge isn't loud. It's evidence. That night, after Clara left the house, fell back into its usual rhythm. The low hum of the TV, the muffled laughter from Ryan's room, the soft beep of my oxygen machine, keeping time like a metronome for my thoughts. But something inside me had changed. The helplessness that used to fill my chest was replaced by a quiet clarity. I realized I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to listen. The next morning, I started building my own kind of defense, not made of words or confrontations, but of evidence. I found an old voice recorder in one of the boxes Daniel had never bothered to unpack. It was dusty and scratched, but it worked. I hid it behind the bookshelf in the hallway, another under the end table by the kitchen, and one more near the air vent in the living room. Each click of the record button felt like a small act of rebellion. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was documenting. Every cruel word, every dismissive shaggy, every moment they forgot I was still there. I captured it all. It didn't take long before Daniel gave me the first piece of proof. He was pacing the hall one night, talking to Olivia after a few drinks. His voice was sharp, careless, full of that bitter confidence that only comes when a person thinks no one's listening. "She's just wasting space," he said. "Every month it's another tank, another bill. She's tougher than she looks, like some old phone battery that won't die. Keeping her alive is costing us." I sat in my room listening from the other side of the wall, my heart steady but cold. Every word cut deep. But instead of breaking me, it built something inside. Something steady, deliberate. He didn't know it, but with every sentence he was helping me. My silence had finally turned into a mirror, one that showed the truth of who he had become. Days turned into weeks. The recordings filled up each one a puzzle piece in a picture of neglect that was no longer invisible. I started keeping a small notebook beside my bed, marking dates and times, noting the details, how long the oxygen had been unplugged, when the meals stopped being warm, the bruises that appeared when no one moved the boxes out of my way. The evidence grew quietly hidden in plain sight. I didn't record for revenge, I did it for validation. For every older person who's ever been called dramatic, forgetful, or difficult, just for asking to be treated with dignity. I wanted proof that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means strategy, and when you've been dismissed long enough, the smallest bit of truth becomes power. A recording here, a note there. It was like weaving my own armor out of moments everyone else thought were meaningless. That's what they never understood. They believed they were erasing me. But I was writing myself back into existence, one recording at a time. Weeks passed, and with every recording my resolve grew sharper. But power, real power, sometimes hides in the places you least expect. It doesn't always come from anger or revenge. Sometimes it sits quietly in a drawer, waiting to be remembered. One afternoon, Clara came to visit with a bag of soup and her usual soft smile. She sat beside me, scrolling through her phone as I showed her the notes I'd been keeping, the times, the dates, the things Daniel said when he thought no one could hear. I expected sympathy. Instead, I saw something else in her eyes, recognition. "Grandma," she said carefully, "do you remember the company I started when I was 16? The little medical device project for seniors?" Of course I remembered. Back then, no bank wanted to give a loan to a teenager, so I used my savings, $30,000 I had scraped together over decades of tax seasons and thrift store furniture. I told her it wasn't an investment, it was belief. Clara pulled up a document on her screen and turned it toward me. "You still own 30% of it. We just closed another round of funding." For a moment I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. My name was there, typed neatly on the shareholder record, untouched and legally binding. I sat there in silence, staring at the screen. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it meant. For the first time in years, I held something Daniel couldn't touch, manipulate, or guilt me out of. Something that was mine, clean, earned, and powerful. Clara smiled through tears. "You gave me a start, Grandma. But you never gave up your part. You believed in me. That's worth something now." And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I had been treated like a burden for so long that I forgot I had once built things, paid bills, raised a family, balanced numbers that made other people's lives work. I wasn't just someone to take care of. I had once been the caretaker. I looked at Clara and said softly, half to her and half to myself, "You don't have to shout to be strong. Sometimes all you need is good paperwork." It sounds simple, but it's true. When life takes everything from you, your dignity, your freedom, your voice, The law can become your whisper of justice. I had spent months letting Daniel's cruelty define the story, but now I realized I could write the ending myself. That old investment was more than forgotten stock. It was leverage, a door back into control. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had proof I had value, and I had a plan. From that day forward, I stopped thinking like a victim. I started thinking like the accountant I once was, precise, patient, and unafraid of balance sheets. And as it turned out, revenge doesn't always wear anger's face. Sometimes it wears glasses, holds a pen, and knows exactly where to sign. The following week, Clara drove me downtown under the pretense of a routine checkup. But instead of the clinic, she parked in front of a small law office tucked between a bakery and a thrift store. The gold letters on the door read, Lowell and Associates. I hadn't been there in years. Mr. Lowell was the same lawyer who handled George's estate after he passed. He had kind eyes, the sort that never looked rushed. When I stepped into his office, he smiled warmly. Mrs. Graves, he said, you used to bring oatmeal cookies every tax season. I nodded, remembering. This time I told him I brought something less sweet. He listened as I spoke. Every detail, every unplugged cord, every word Daniel had said, every bruise that didn't come from an accident. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he folded his hands and said, You've carried enough. Let's do this properly. I took a deep breath through the oxygen tube and said the words I'd been rehearsing silently for weeks. I want to rewrite my will. We worked slowly, deliberately. Every sentence had weight. Every comma was a boundary. I wanted my story to end not in bitterness, but in balance. All my remaining assets, the savings, the accounts, the shares in Clara's company would go into a foundation. I called it the Second Breath Fund. Its purpose was simple: to help elders who had been abandoned, silenced, or left to fade away in rooms like mine. When Clara protested, saying I didn't need to give it all away, I smiled. I'm not giving it away. I'm giving it meaning. And then came the part that made even Mr. Lowell pause. I asked him to add a clause, a single paragraph that would change everything. Any individual proven to have tampered with my medical equipment or deprived me of proper care shall be permanently disinherited and denied access to any material, financial, or familial benefit from my estate. Mr. Lowell looked up from his notes. That's very specific, he said. I like precision, I replied. I was an accountant. I used to balance other people's numbers. Now I'm balancing justice. For years I had believed that fairness was something you earned through kindness and patience. But I'd learned that some people only understand fairness when it's written in legal language. That afternoon, as I signed the final page, a calmness settled over me. It wasn't revenge I felt. It was restoration. The slow, steady reclaiming of something that had been taken from me. My breath, my dignity, my choice. Mr. Lowell sealed the documents and locked them in his cabinet. These will only be opened when you say so, he said. I thanked him and reached for Clara's hand. Her eyes were wet, but she smiled. You really are unstoppable, Grandma. I laughed softly. Not unstoppable, just tired of being erased. As we left the office, the late afternoon light poured through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. For the first time in a long time, those shadows didn't feel like the end of something. They felt like a beginning the moment I stopped being the victim of their story and started writing my own. And that's the thing about justice. It doesn't always come from anger or force. Sometimes it comes from a pen, a steady hand, and a woman who finally remembers what she's worth. The spark started with a single upload. Clara had been holding on to one of the recordings for weeks, unsure whether to share it. It wasn't an easy choice. No granddaughter wants to expose her own family. But one night, after another argument with Daniel about how much longer I planned to breathe, she decided silence had protected the wrong people long enough. She posted a short clip. Just 10 seconds. The sound of my oxygen machine cutting off. Daniel's voice followed, lazy and cruel. She's lived long enough. If she goes now, we might finally break even. Then came Clara's trembling voice in the background. You're talking about your mother. The video was simple. One still photo, my hand resting on the unplugged hose, and those words. She didn't tag anyone. She didn't need to. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. By morning, the hashtag #BreathForMargaret was everywhere. On TikTok, women my age shared stories of being ignored by their children, forgotten in nursing homes, or treated like burdens in their own houses. On Twitter and Facebook, strangers wrote things like, "Protect the women who raised us, and she gave them life, they took her air." Nurses, caregivers, and even college students began filming themselves holding candles or small oxygen masks in solidarity. It wasn't just a viral trend, it was a reckoning. News outlets picked it up. Talk shows debated it. Late-night hosts made somber jokes about how America treats its elders. My face, the woman they only knew as Margaret from Miami, became a symbol. People didn't know my whole story, but they understood enough to be angry. Daniel tried to claim it was fake. He said the clip was taken out of context, that he'd been joking. But context doesn't laugh like that. Employers heard the audio before he could spin the truth. Within days, he lost his job. Officially, they cited misconduct. Unofficially, no company wanted to be associated with the man who unplugged his mother's oxygen. Olivia left quietly. She packed 2 bags, took Ryan, and moved in with her sister. By then, Ryan had stopped speaking much. Clara told me he had started therapy after one of his classmates showed him a meme of his father. He'd deleted his social media. When she asked him how he felt, he said softly, "I don't want to end up like Dad." That was the first time I cried for him, not because of what he'd said to me before, but because I realized he was finally seeing it. The cycle was breaking. Then the attention grew beyond our neighborhood, beyond the screens. Senators quoted my story on the floor of Congress. Advocacy groups organized marches. One woman in Kentucky sent a letter saying her granddaughter watched the clip with her and asked Grandma, "Do you ever feel like that?" They both cried together. Within a month, a new bill was introduced, Margaret's Law. It called for stronger protections for elderly individuals in home care and stricter penalties for medical neglect by family members. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every parent, every grandparent who had ever been made to feel invisible in the homes they built. I never planned to start a movement. I just wanted to breathe in peace. But sometimes when one voice has been ignored long enough, it echoes louder than anyone expects. Justice doesn't always begin in courtrooms. Sometimes it begins with a whisper on the internet. A truth too raw to stay hidden, and a granddaughter brave enough to hit post. The day of the will reading felt like a funeral, only no one had died. Not yet, anyway. The family arrived at Mr. Lowell's office, dressed in muted colours, their faces a strange mix of grief and calculation. Daniel wore a black shirt with the store tag still tucked under the collar. Olivia clutched a box of tissues like a prop, and Ryan kept his earbuds in chewing gum like he'd been dragged there against his will. They thought they were about to collect what remained of me. The receptionist led them into a quiet conference room lined with dark wood. Clara and Mr. Lowell were already seated, calm, waiting. Daniel frowned, scanning the room. "Where's the urn?" he asked. Mr. Lowell folded his hands. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said evenly. "Mrs. Graves is not deceased." Before anyone could speak, the screen on the wall flickered to life. And there I was, alive, breathing, steady, sitting in my favorite chair, the one with Clara's crocheted blanket across the back. The oxygen tube was gone now. I looked straight into the camera. My voice was calm, measured. If you're watching this, you were expecting silence, maybe even a little celebration. But I'm still here, and so is the truth. Olivia's eyes widened. Ryan pulled out one earbud. Daniel's jaw tightened. I continued, Daniel. You once told your son I was like a cockroach with good credit. You laughed about unplugging my oxygen as if it were a financial strategy. You stole air from my lungs to charge your phone. And now you think you deserve something from me. The room went silent. Daniel shifted in his chair, his face pale but defiant. I paused just long enough for the weight of my words to settle. You broke the most sacred contract, I said. My breath for your convenience. But convenience ends here. Mr. Lowell slid a folder across the table. Effective immediately, he read aloud. Daniel Graves is disinherited and is legally required to repay all funds taken under the pretense of elder care, totaling $72,840. Daniel jumped up. This is a joke. She's senile. You can't enforce this. Mr. Lowell raised one eyebrow. The recordings say otherwise. Daniel turned to Olivia for backup, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. I spoke again from the screen. Olivia, I don't believe you were cruel, but you watched. You heard me struggle and you folded laundry. Silence is not innocence when it stands beside cruelty. Mr. Lowell handed Olivia a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from me. She read it silently, her hands trembling, tears filling her eyes. Then came Ryan. As for you, Mr. Lowell said gently, sliding a single page toward him. Your grandmother hasn't disinherited you, but she has set one condition. Ryan read aloud, his voice shaky. Before any contact with elderly individuals, especially me, you must complete a certified empathy and elder care program, including counseling. He paused, swallowing hard. You are not a lost cause, but you must choose to be better. For once, the boy who always had a snarky comment said nothing. He just nodded. Finally, I turned to Clara. My voice softened. Clara, you asked questions when no one else did. You brought warmth when all I was given was cold. You held my hand when it trembled, and my secrets when they were too heavy to carry. You are my breath now. Mr. Lowell placed a thick folder in front of her. Your grandmother has named you the sole executor of the Second Breath Foundation, he said. All remaining assets, financial and otherwise, are under your stewardship. Daniel laughed bitterly. So she gave it all to Clara. Mr. Lowell smiled faintly. She gave it to someone who listened. The video continued, and I spoke one last time. I used to think my final act would be quiet, like a breath fading out. But now I see it can be a message, a signature, a refusal to disappear. You wanted me gone, but I will echo in every page of that will, in every life the foundation helps, in every woman who realizes her silence has power too. The screen faded to black. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then Clara stood, gathering her things. Come on, she said softly. Grandma's waiting for me. And just like that, she left them behind, sitting at a table where their names used to be, surrounded by what could have been. People think revenge is loud, fiery, dramatic, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's just a calm woman signing her name on a document that changes everything. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I signed. And that signature spoke louder than any apology ever could. A year passed, and life found a quieter rhythm, one that finally belonged to me. I now lived with Clara on a small stretch of land just outside Homestead, Florida. The air there smelled of citrus and rain, clean and forgiving. The mornings were soft, filled with birdsong and the creak of an old rocking chair that sat on the porch. It used to irritate me, that sound. Now it reminded me I was still here breathing freely without wires or fear. My days were simple again. I watered marigolds, fed the chickens, and wrote in my journal, which would later become my memoir, The Price of Air. Clara teased me about my shaky handwriting, saying it looked like the truth, trembling its way onto the page. She wasn't wrong. Each word carried the weight of what it took to reclaim my breath and my dignity. Clara was rarely home for long. The Second Breath Foundation had grown beyond anything we imagined. What started as one small building with 12 beds had become 5 centers across the state, each a safe haven for people like me, forgotten parents, widows and grandparents left behind in quiet neglect. Volunteers came from all walks of life: young nurses, retired teachers, even a few former social workers who said they wished they'd known sooner how many stories were hidden behind closed doors. In its first year alone, the foundation helped over 100 seniors find food, shelter, and more importantly, a reason to keep living. Some came from hospital hallways, others were dropped off like old coats by children too busy or too tired to care. Each one left with a little more warmth, a little more breath. Meanwhile, Daniel was still serving his sentence at Miami-Dade Correctional. One afternoon, he found an envelope in his cell. My name was written neatly on the front. Inside was a single page, a letter that took me months to finish. It said, "Daniel, you once thought you could take my breath, but I used that breath to change a generation. You wanted silence, but I turned it into a voice. You thought you ended something, but you started something bigger, a movement that made the world listen." I don't know if he cried or if he even read it twice, but I like to think that for the first time in years, he understood the difference between breathing and merely existing. Sometimes Clara and I would sit together on the porch at sunset, watching the sky turn gold behind the barn. She'd sip her tea and ask, "Do you ever miss the noise, Grandma?" I'd smile and shake my head. No. Silence saved me. It taught me how to listen, how to plan, how to survive. She'd reach for my hand, squeeze it gently and say, "You changed everything." But the truth is, I didn't change the world. I just remembered who I was. The world changed because one quiet woman refused to disappear. Now when the wind moves through the trees and the marigolds rustle softly, I think about how every breath, even the last one, can carry meaning. I think about all the people who found hope because one story dared to be told. And as I close my eyes, the air feels different. Not heavy like before, but full alive with everything I had left behind. Because in the end, they thought my breath was just survival. But I breathed to prove something much bigger. That when an old woman takes a breath, the world should stop and listen.